Okay, Merry Christmas. I've got some quiet time. All my festivities are moving to next week. But anyway, very exciting. So anyone who knows me knows why I'm chuckling a little bit when I say I've been reading this book. Now, I'm halfway through it, and it's weird that I'm doing, I guess, a review in two parts. One now where I think I'm on like page 116, so halfway through. I'm halfway through the book, and I'm kind of review. Not really review, I guess. I'm going to talk about some of the revelations in there. Actually, a lot of it isn't worth talking about. Les had sex with a lot of people. There was a few pages right there, but I didn't want to miss out on a few things that came out of this while they were fresh in my memory. I mean, I literally just read them over the past 24 hours. I read so much, and so much went into my mind. And there were some small details that led me to so many other things that I hadn't really thought about before. So I have to thank Les for providing some of these details. One in particular, well, two really important details that I didn't know about and weren't mentioned in things that I had read before. So let's remember there are two details. Hopefully, now I get accused of drinking too much, but literally I was reading and then I had one beer. So it's really, if I miss out on the two details, that's just me being old, essentially being an old person. So yeah, talking about this book, boy, Les really hated Eric. Now, having said that, I have received messages in the past that were so awful that I had no interest in reading this book after what I had read. I had one person tell me, Les enjoyed the first several albums because he was the only person performing on them, and he said that in his book, and he thought it was great. And I thought, well, it just seems misleading because I mentioned before, like, after a while, you can hear Eric Faulkner's guitar tone. It's kind of unmistakable after time. But someone mentioned in Bay City Rollers Army that no, in Les's book, he specified that by the time they got to their second album, there were no studio musicians present at all. And now, I think there is some misleading stuff for sure, and I think part of it is Les being new to the band. Right? I mean, the hit single "Remember" was already out with Nobby's voice on it. Les was brought in, had to re-record the voice, and then session musicians also were re-recording part of that song or something for like Top of the Pops. Maybe the band was involved, maybe they weren't, who knows. But we do know now that on the first album, on the songs that the band wrote, and I also believe on the covers, but no one mentions the cover songs on there. On the songs that the band wrote, they were playing, and I've had to say this several times, but I think Les here is not really either wasn't familiar with the fact that when he wasn't doing his vocals, band members were actually recording, or maybe he just didn't think those songs were important, although he co-wrote one of those songs. Who knows what was going on there, but I think clarification is required again because it's kind of made out that, Eric's not doing anything on this. Even his voice is cut out on some of the songs and he just has a few voice pieces and that's it, which is not true. So there's that clarity. But the other thing that's going on here, and this reminds me of some of the messages I've received from some people, and it's this basic lack of logic that people have. People have no sense of logic. Like some of the things people have said to me, it's like, oh well, that's why their live recordings sounded different from the studio because they weren't playing on all these albums, on like 4 albums they're claiming, and it's like, well, you realize there's like string sections and accordions and violins and all this other stuff on all these songs that they're not going to play live. They're playing electric guitar with keyboards and bass and drums, you know. So that's like a logical, like, it's a fallacy. But the other logic issue on here is that, you know, in one sentence, and he's talking about the Roland album, and he's also talking about getting into the music business. In one sentence, he's like, if you're going to get into it, generally what he's saying is, it has to be because you love music and you have a passion for music, and you're never, ever going to let any of the other stuff get in the way of that. And then on both sides of having said that, he's like, oh, well, you know, Eric didn't get to play on the first record, you know, but that's fine. What? So Les is supposed to be there because he loves music and he's going, you know, but for Eric, it's like, well, why do you expect to play on the album, you know? And it's because there is this obvious, there's this dislike, you know, and, you know, I don't want to make too much about that because one of my other favorite bands is the Ramones, and isn't it funny? The guitarist and the lead singer and the Ramones had so many problems with each other, you know. It's just one of those things. Now, I made a video in the past talking about producers because to me they are the real culprits, because sometimes the producers will take the vocalists aside. And they love the vocalist because the vocalist to them, they can't be replaced. But musicians can just be, in their minds, can be replaced. You know, ask Black Sabbath, right? Not true. But in pop music, they think this is generally the case. And you know, for some bands that is the case. I consider the Strokes to be a kind of a pop band. Can you just like throw people out of the band and replace them and they're still the Strokes? I don't think so. But anyway, is it hypocrisy? It's hypocrisy. It is a flaw in logic, and anyone that believes it and goes along with this entire thing is you're simply just buying into something because someone that you are hugely influenced by has said it. It's absolutely untrue. Well, it's a flaw in logic. You can't say in one sentence that you get into the music business because you love music, and then the next sentence say it's fine if you're not playing. Those two things go directly against each other. Okay, so that was one thing that I wanted to talk about. So I did, glancing forward, I also saw in the book that there was mention of, you know, why can't we just have people write songs for us? We're the biggest band in the world, and etc. And I also noticed that, I'm going to say this. Halfway through, I don't get the feeling that Les believes that they're a great band. And I don't get the feeling that he has huge respect for the band. And I can understand that from the perspective of they were all very young and in many ways inexperienced. Even with the gigging, there's experience that comes outside of the gigging. And that was one point. There was one point that he brought up in here that I'm so thankful that he brought up, because I read, and you know what? I have to pause this because I have to go get the other book. 1 second. Yeah, so this is another book that I had read recently, which I really enjoyed. This is a great one. Don't Stop the Music, The Bay City Rollers on Record, updated and revised by Hannes Jansson. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Because I pronounced it differently last time, but then other people were pronouncing differently from what I was. But anyway, there was one page in there where it was mentioned that someone was brought into the studio to help Eric to tune his guitar. And I thought, oh, you must be talking about someone else. Like, Woody was pretty young, and maybe he wasn't playing guitar for as long, and maybe he needed help. But I was like, I mean, it's pretty basic to tune a guitar. But Les has the same story in here. And what he's talking about is the bridge on an electric guitar is what they were actually having to adjust. And I want to kind of talk about that because this had me thinking so many things about the first two albums and the songs that were composed by the band that I absolutely love. And we'll get to that. So anyway, here you have an acoustic guitar. And with this, you see you have the bridge here. And it's somewhat, it's pretty much static. Like a luthier will make perhaps some changes to that, but you've got these pegs and they go across this. And then you have your tuners up here, right? An electric guitar is a completely different beast. And what you have, this is not a Stratocaster, I don't have one, I have a Telecaster. But anyway, you have these bridge saddles, and they are going to be adjusting the height, and they are also going to be adjusting the distance between here and here. Well, you can't actually see the two, so that the intonation is correct, right? And the height is very important as well, so that you don't get string buzz, and you have to be able to easily hit individual strings and all that. But so what was happening was that they were having trouble with their guitars, apparently. So I've read this now in two sources. So there was a problem with intonation on their electric guitars, and they did get some assistance. Now, they did not get assistance in tuning their guitars. What they did was they had someone come in that actually knew guitar setup. I'm not saying the person was a luthier, but he knew guitar setup. And guitar setup on an electric guitar well, I don't know how simple it is because I don't do it. What I do with my electric guitars is every 6 months to a year, I take them in to a professional who redoes the setup to adjust for any changes and all that sort of stuff, and then they polish it and all that. And so essentially what was being said there is that they needed their guitars set up. They came in with their guitars not set up, and they needed a setup. So if you're playing live through loud amplifiers and all that sort of stuff, you might be able to get away with it. But when you're in the studio, you need perfection. You know, this is something that's going to be recorded and you can't change it afterwards. And so you need perfection. And so they fixed the intonation on their guitars and off they went. And they recorded the second album, which is fantastic. But the thing about that is, someone would still say, well, if they're professional musicians, shouldn't they be able to do that themselves? You know, these days we have what we call guitar techs. You see them all the time. They're setting up the guitars. In live performances, they're all being tuned. The intonation's being fixed. They're off to the side. And they hand that to the performer who expects perfection at that point in time, right? And I can't say what things were like back then as far as guitar techs go and if people use luthiers. But I think in rock and roll, you have to be able to set up your guitar. Which I still can't. I can change my strings and I can tune, you know. But that's what I was saying. But then that was leading me down this whole rabbit hole where I was thinking about Eric and electric guitar, because we've seen what's happened to his guitar from the mid-70s with that. It's white with that black set of black stripes across it, and how much he's changed that thing, right? And also, I've talked about how great his tone was for the recording of the Roller World CD, which was live, right? But I think perhaps that side of Eric hadn't come out yet. And when you listen to, like, my favorite songs on the first two albums, many of them they're all written by the band. I like the songs the band wrote. But they're acoustic, and there's a lot of acoustic instruments on the first two albums. That changes with the third album, and it all makes sense because we know, Eric being Eric and Woody being the main songwriters, and Eric having played acoustic instruments since he was, I think, 6 years old, was very familiar with them. And I was really thinking that really gave the band a nice different sound to a lot of the bands that were coming out in rock, because they were all about really loud and distorted guitars and stuff like that. But the thing is, those kinds of songs are very difficult to play live through a PA with a huge audience. They became so big. We really didn't hear those songs so much, and everything changed. Another thing that I want to mention is that I stumbled upon a page later on, and I think I mentioned this about how I mentioned this already. How, can't we or maybe it was an interview. I read an interview actually saying, it could, where Les was generally saying we could have just had, we were the biggest band in the world, we could have had just someone write songs for us, and then we'd be huge. And everyone knows my opinion on that. That works for some people. Mostly it doesn't. But the thing I want to say about that is that so the thing is, the Bay City Rollers were extremely successful, and then they were not successful. And I kind of want to get into my feeling on what happened. So I need to take a sip of beer because I'm getting dried out here. In music, the United States market is incredibly important. In world economics, the United States is incredibly important. Why? They are the consumer of last resort. The United States is a consumption society unlike any other. Now, this is starting to change as other, countries, but especially when we go back to, I don't want to show that yet. Especially when we go back to the 70s. I mean, that the United States was far ahead of any other country as far as consumption. Plus, there's a lot of wealth in the United States. There's so much money there. So if you have a hit in the United States, it means so much more. And I think Arista were obsessed with this. Oh yeah, so one point I want to mention before going on about this. So I mentioned the one point where Les said they really needed their intonation fixed on their guitars. But another thing that he mentioned was that Arista demanded that no session musicians be used. And he actually says, maybe it was their way of trying to get us off the label. And if that's the case, it backfired because we released a #1 album. And the band proved themselves completely, right? But anyway, talking about the United States and what happened, and how did the Rollers fall off the rails when they were doing so well? And to me, it comes down to two things. Number one, they decided to release as promote as the big song from this new band, Saturday Night, which was written by songwriters that the band was no longer even associated with. And was not, in my opinion, nearly as strong as the stuff that the band was now coming out with, and were about to come out with. And so that's the first problem, is that now you have this band showing up. For the people that do like Saturday Night, they're getting completely different music from that because it's old, and those songwriters aren't there anymore. It's not a great song comparatively. And then for the people that don't like it, they're never going to listen to the Bay City Rollers because they're like, if this is what they're about, I'm not interested, right? But they still did well, and that Bay City Rollers record did really well. And then Once Upon a Star was not released in the United States. But let's talk quickly. I've already covered this before, but so the next thing that comes out after the Bay City Rollers compilation in the United States is Rock and Roll Love Letter. And so, like, to everyone in the UK, this is generally singles like Rock and Roll Love Letter and Money Honey mixed with everything that the band had actually written, a bunch of stuff that the band had actually written on the Once Upon a Star and Wouldn't You Like It album. And the thing I have to say about this is that I think this is, if this were to be recorded as a studio album, it is the best pop studio album of the 1970s. Unfortunately, it spans across some singles and 2 albums, but let's not forget, all of this music was recorded and written probably in like a year and a half or something. Like, it's a ridiculously short time frame. And every song on here, to me, is a possible hit that wasn't really promoted by Arista the way it should have been. And the problem becomes this didn't go as high up in the charts as it should have in the United States. I think it did hit. Well, actually, let's pull it up. Rock and Roll Love Letter album. Let's see. Now, here in Canada, we loved it, you know. In the United States, it got to 31. So essentially you have what's supposed to be the biggest band in the world not cracking the top 20 with this incredible album. And I know I'm going to be reading in the second half of this book about failures and the bands are, I don't get the sense that Les had a lot of faith in the songwriting duo that they had. But I want to mention something. Essentially, what was happening with the Bay City Rollers is that they were on the cusp of discovering something. And that's something that they were on the cusp of discovering. They were heading there, and I think the song "Wouldn't You Like It" approaches as closely as they ever were to get. Was approaching what was going to be called punk rock soon. And I know I talk about this all the time, how the Ramones were inspired by the Bay City Rollers, and then the Ramones went out and they defined what punk was. And a lot of people disagree and say, oh, punk goes back to Lou Reed and all that. I won't have it. They figured out, the dress code, the style of the music, and then banged out an album that was different from anything that ever existed before. And they were inspired in some ways by the Bay City Rollers. But let's not forget, the Ramones did not sell records, especially in the United States. Neither of these bands could really sell records the way they should have. And that is because music in the United States was dominated by, funk and stuff like that, and modern soul that was going to be, becoming like 80s soul later on. Then you end up with stuff like Thriller by Michael Jackson, right? And then you have Off the Wall by Michael Jackson, so you have that. But then they just also have this album-oriented rock. And stuff like Fleetwood Mac and stuff like that. And they just didn't have the interest in it. The interest absolutely on the mass was not there for bands that were essentially playing pop rock and roll. It just wasn't there. So my feeling on that is, you can pay songwriters, but what's the point of even being a band at that point in time? Just pack it in and a lot of things I read in here with Les is like, it sounds like what you want to be is a solo artist, really, where, just write songs, I'll sing them, we'll make it a hit, and that'll be the way it goes, and that's fine. But as far as, that wedge in the band that obviously seems to exist here, I also hold producers at fault for that, because producers are very knowledgeable. They've been around longer than any new band that comes along, and they know that they can influence the band in certain ways, and they can make money off of the band in many ways by not allowing the band to have songs on the album and not allowing the band to have the A or B side on their singles, right? And so that's, for me, it's like older people with a lot of knowledge taking advantage of younger people is what that really comes down to. So anyway, my feeling about, the things, like Les is disparaging, I think that's a word, of Eric. And, we know that Eric is a tremendous, you just look at all the songs that he wrote on this. I would even say, like, the Rock and Roll Love Letter is the only song on that album that they didn't write, but it's his guitar lick that elevates it from the original version of Rock and Roll Love Letter. It takes it to a whole new place, and that's why it turned into one of the most incredible, I would call that one like a power pop hit, one of the best ever recorded. But then I lost my train of thought by going through that. I don't know if I have all that much else to say. I do want to read the rest of the book. I'm interested if I'll get to the bottom of, did these two just like butt heads all the time? Was it that logic that, oh, music is important, but your music isn't important? Or did something happen later on, and I'll find out about that. But at the same time, I don't take it too seriously, because I see this in every other band. I think what I would generally say is that being in a band is hell. From everything that I've read, it just seems like hell, and music is hell as well. Just ask the Bee Gees, everything that they went through, and they went through it several times. Just awful. So anyway, I'm looking forward to the second half of the book. Yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. Merry Christmas. Hope it didn't ruin anyone's day.